and serving, with that of preserving and serving the state. Christian religiosity is thus easily co-opted for solely political ends, easily baptizing any political ambition with religious weight and supposedly Christian blessing because of the dynamics of civil religion. How then are Christians to be good neighbors in this context? If not civil religion, what other framework can we think toward political engagement for Christians? We argue that given these state-religion complexities, a path forward for meaningful political engagement exists in listening to the very insights and stories of historically marginalized communities. While this is not necessarily a new insight, our particular experiences as Japanese Americans and Filipino Americans are case studies for political engagement that help to imagine a path forward that neither abdicates engagement with the public square nor gives into the fantasies of nationalism. This is our roadmap for this presentation. I will lay out a framework for how civil religion is a problematic way for the way that it assumes a white masculinist vantage point. Through a quick summary of current faith-based models of political engagement, as well as modes of engagement found in scripture, we will draw out some contours, possibilities, and flat sides of current conceptions of Christian faithfulness in the public square. Finally, we will share examples of Filipino and Japanese American instances of political engagement and suggest ways that Christians more broadly might learn from these two particular experiences. It is from the particularity of our concrete realities and identities that Nikki Toyama-Szeto, a Japanese American woman, and I, David De León, a Filipino American man, write with the hope that we are embodying an epistemological humility. To borrow from the term from the theologian Willie James Jennings, we offer up our fragments of faith, intellect, and story to this task. And we trust that you can find universal meaning in the particularities of our stories that we share. A little bit more on civil religion. Civil religion as a concept was pioneered by the sociologist, political scientist that I mentioned earlier, Robert Bellah, in order to explain the quasi-religious features that exist within the United States government and political discourse. We unpack this a little bit more in the fuller version of our paper that you can get access to after this. Ultimately, he advocates for civil religion to enact a sort of political cohesion. This view, however, seems to ultimately put the church in service of the state. While the object of worship for American civil religion is clearly not the Christian God, though some on the more fundamentalist or conservative end of the religious political spectrum would perhaps deny this, the God of civil religion ultimately seems to be the nation itself. This conceptual double usage of God creates a slippery terrain for Christians. Which God are they indeed serving? Christians must be able to differentiate the love of God and love of neighbor from slippage into the love for the nation state as though it were God. When civil religion is used as a means of building societal and political cohesion, difference and diversity are made out to be problems that must be overcome. What scholars like Bellah and those who have followed him fail to account for in their work is that difference and diversity are always political and are not ever separated from the realities or consequences of politics. Difference is not apolitical, and to imagine how difference as historically neutral underscores the problem with civil religion's ways of knowing, or civil religion's epistemology. This frame of thinking inevitably prioritizes and assumes white masculinist epistemology as that of the norm. As such, difference is targeted to be overcome instead of engaged with for its resources and expanded ways of knowing. The politics and material histories that have given rise to how difference is experienced today must be acknowledged. Any national civil religious discourse, then, that attempts to use God as a symbol of unity while insufficiently addressing legacies of injustice and oppression that have been rooted in difference is dishonest, manipulative, and ultimately evil. As such, we must consider the histories and knowledge of communities whose difference has been framed as a problem. Only then can Christians engage in the political and public square without uncritically and unwittingly serving the state. In our research, we've identified a couple observations about current models of Christian engagement, and obviously you are likely to find other means of engaging, but for the purposes of this argument, we present two that sort of typify how Christians may think of engagement in the United States today. These two models of engagement encompass what might be understood as Christian civic engagement or Christian faith in the public square. The first of these is an overtly political engagement model. What this does is it creates language or provides a Christian perspective to participate in the current political and civic cultural institutions. This has shades in both conservative and progressive politics. An example of this is Justin Giboney's AND campaign, which helps to cultivate a political ethic that uses the love of neighbor as a hermeneutical lens. While useful in helping to create a voting ethic for Christians, its love framework can be stretched to accommodate almost any political commitment. Another mode of engagement demonstrates a faithful witness in the public square model. This mode has no overt or intentional or explicit political connotation. It largely refers to bringing the life of the church outside the walls of the church, usually for the sake of evangelistic compassion or outreach ministries. Instances of divisive politics are avoided to create as broad an appeal as possible for as many people as possible. This is useful in its calls for unity, but its attempt at apoliticism unwittingly reinforces the status quo of injustice and oppression. I'm going to move on to considering what in modes of engagement with the political square, political engagement can look like from Scripture. We understand Scripture as collective memory which transcends generations. Biblical characters and their stories provide some framework to inform Christian faithfulness in the public square. And so we highlight three keys for civic engagement that we've gleaned from Scripture. And again, I'm sure if you tried harder, you could likely find many, many more. The first of this is the leader model. The second of which is the ambivalence model, and the third is a spiritual community model. Hebrew Scripture accounts like Nehemiah and the story of Exodus provide us stories of singular leaders who represent their people to dominant powers. Moses receives a call from God to confront Pharaoh and lead his people out of Egypt into the wilderness on the way to the promised land. Nehemiah is a cupbearer to the king of Persia, and with his access to power, advocates on behalf of God's people. He requests for materials to restore Jerusalem's wall, and his boldness in appealing to the king and organizing this restoration provides great touch points for us to consider what advocacy might look like. These modes of engagement show the connectedness of an individual to a community and what leadership can look like. That said, it can be hard to translate these heroic stories to those of everyday political engagements for Christians. The ambivalence model. In the Gospels and in Acts, Dr. Melba Magay out of the Philippines reads Jesus's own political self-awareness in light of the state as one that is both subversive and supportive. It's a position of ambiguity with regards to Jesus's own kingship, a position which denies Jesus's kingship as simply political and temporal, but also resists the temptation to only spiritualize Jesus's kingship as eschatological or transcendent. It is both. Magai reads this in Jesus' confrontation with Pontius Pilate regarding his kingship in the Gospel of John. The implications of such a position articulates the role of the church as a prophetic sign to the powers of the world, state power included. Ambivalence, then, toward the state on the part of the Christian is the key concept in this framework. The Christian posture is both subversive and supportive, working to overthrow or work outside of the current structures of power while also working within them. There is a tension that is held between the political, temporal, and the spiritual. This ambivalent posture toward the state can only be engaged if Christians are rooted in subversive spiritual community. Willie Jennings, in his Acts commentary, explores how the early church community, in its story and life together, was able to resist the temptation of nationalism, the same issue that many Christians face today. To quote him, "They will give room to the witness, making their lives a stage on which the resurrected Jesus will appear and claim each creature as his own, as a site of love and desire." End quote. Jennings here suggests a praxis of public engagement rooted in spirituality. It is a spirituality of belonging, of communion, of memory, and desire. How might Christians in their political engagement be marked by these things, by belonging, by communion, by memory and desire? Though these examples in Scripture engage particular individuals, these are people who see themselves again as extensions of their own communities. Nehemiah, in his longing for the restoration of Israel and the dignity of Jerusalem to be restored, acts with the community in mind. Jesus, knowing the wholeness, justice, and healing brought on by the coming of his own reign, acts with ambivalence toward political power in his time. In Acts, his disciples follow his lead of ambivalence toward the state. It is this ambivalence that they are able to live into modes of political engagement that not only struggle for the conditions under which the church can grow and thrive, but also to bear witness to the life of Jesus, such that their modes of political and public engagement resist the inward inertia of nationalism, but embody the expansiveness of God's family. In this final section of the presentation, we turn to our particular examples, and these are the insights from marginalized communities, at least here in the United States, communities who've experienced historical marginalization. German Catholic theologian J.V. Metz has a notion of dangerous memory. I'll say that again, it's dangerous memory. And it is a memory that puts demands on Christians in the present moment, pressing them to call into account the structures and forces that continue to deal out death, destruction, and oppression. We suggest that the experiences of Japanese American and Filipino American political engagement can be read as dangerous memories as well. They are memories that haunt us in the present moment and demand us to act within the power of the Spirit, such that the atrocities and injustices suffered by those who came before us no longer happen. Womanist theologian M. Sean Copeland understands the recalling and remembering of these experiences as acts of solidarity that transcend time. We are accountable to the victims of history in this present moment here. As we search for creative and overlooked examples of faithful political and public engagement as Christians, these fragments of story and movement remind us as dangerous memories of the future that Christ is bringing. Larry Itliong and the Filipino-American social movements. Larry Itliong was a labor organizer without whom the formation of the United Farm Workers Union in the United States would not have taken place. Born in the Philippines in 1913, he was raised in the era of American colonialism in the Philippines. He immigrated to the United States in 1929 amidst an era of intense anti-Filipino sentiment. Though his plan was to initially earn money, get educated, and return to the Philippines, he very quickly realized that his idea of what life in the United States would be like for him were cheap fantasies that he had bought into. Seeing the poor conditions of other Filipino migrant workers like him, he got involved in labor organizing, from the fish canneries of Alaska all the way down to the fields in Southern California. He quickly gained reputation as a successful labor organizer. In September of 1965, in California's Central Valley, the Delano grape strike began. León approached Cesar Chavez, who was a labor leader for Mexican-American farm workers, to ask if his Mexican-American farm workers would strike with the Filipino workers whom León represented. Chavez initially refused and stated that his people were not yet ready to strike. León responded to Chavez with this ultimatum: unless the Mexican Americans would join them in their strike, then he guaranteed Chavez that the Filipinos would return the favor of breaking any strike the Mexican Americans might go on in the future. This proved to be consequential, as Chavez was pressed to call for a strike with his workers as well. For the first time ever in the United States, Filipino and Mexican farm workers joined a shared effort of advocating for better wages and rights. On a more basic level, it was the first time that Mexican and Filipino farm workers sat down with one another and even shared a meal at all. The strike lasted for 5 years and grew into a nationwide boycott, and the effects were historical, as it was the first time that agricultural workers had secured contracts with meaningful wage increases and labor protections. León's often overlooked story reminds us of the power of solidarity, especially across racial or ethnic lines. It is the political action that looks beyond one's identity group's interests to see what commonality can be built toward a more just future. It took place with an ambivalence toward the state, relying on it only for legislation once the movement for better working conditions for farm laborers had been launched. It embodies in many ways the spirit of communion and desire. This insight is valuable for Christians seeking meaningful social change in this current moment. Though it's easy for Christians or local churches to prioritize their own interests, to do so without the consideration of shared interests with neighbors who may or may not be Christians at all, squanders opportunities for solidarity and partnership. Though imperfect in his approach, León's story models for us the shrewdness with which Christians must consider partnership with other groups who on the surface may not seem like likely partners. The final example of the Japanese Americans in World War II. During World War II, approximately 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were incarcerated in internment camps. The systematic incarceration of people of Japanese descent without due process disrupted and humiliated the Japanese American community. Though the government often described this action as for their own protection, historical consensus shows that the underlying policy was based on racial bias against East Asians. Japanese American families were rounded up, housed in racetrack animal pens, and then shipped to hastily constructed barracks in remote areas away from the coasts. Many people lost their homes, property, and businesses, and families were separated. Under the trauma of this experience, Japanese cultural values of respect for hierarchy, the priority of communal dignity, loyalty, and a communal orientation marked how they responded. There's a statement that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. This exemplified a posture of a communal response, an exhortation to not change the norms of what was happening, but to conform. In the Japanese cultural milieu is also a posture of fatalism, exemplified by another common phrase used at the time, shigata ga nai, loosely translated of, it can't be helped or nothing can be done about it. The Japanese American Christian Church at the time, in the period after the mass incarceration, largely attempted to assimilate into American culture. Their churches didn't respond or address the trauma of the displacement, but instead the response was to build the churches or rebuild the churches that had been lost. Japanese Americans responded by raising their children and naming them quintessential American names, largely rejecting the culture in favor of assimilation, likely as a survival response. Outside the church, there was a growing activist movement, as well as an increase in the number of Japanese Americans who pursued law or legal professions. Working after World War II ended, these groups led the charge for reparations for Japanese Americans, worked to create memorials and museums, and developed legislation to make sure that people groups were not going to be targeted the way that they were during World War II. What is of note is the subsequent generations of Japanese American activists. There's a renewed engagement today around the fate of undocumented immigrants and dreamers because Japanese American activists were and are informed by the memory of the experiences of their family and informed by their Christian faith in work for the prophetic to the political systems while also working from within the systems. Japanese American activists also work for the reparation movements of people descended from enslaved African Americans. Many of these activists articulate a conviction about being informed by the memory of the injustice of the past, a memory that informs their current actions. The current expressions are often led by Japanese American activists to support issues outside of the Japanese community. Activists like Yuri Kochiyama are an example of this type of work. Gleaning from these accounts, here are some shared themes that emerge. The first is the working across lines of difference. In León's story and that of Japanese American activists, we need a pattern of these communities in partnership with other marginalized communities to work for a common cause. This may be noted as the political and social power of the groups was not enough to stand alone as subversive presence for change. Solidarity was necessary. The second is that the posture of memories that inform the current day. In this way, there's a generational approach to political engagement, as opposed to categories of individuals who are making change immediately. In ways that León was informed by his community's upbringing under American colonialism, and as well as the Japanese posture of the common memory of their community being incarcerated, these memories inform the current work. Finally, to begin with the end, Melba Magai with great clarity discusses a Christian civic engagement that is ambivalent, a politics of ambivalence. It is both subversive, meaning prophetic, and working to radically change the system. It is also supportive, working within the system that are current for reforms that would become institutionalized. From the Filipino community and the Japanese American community, there wasn't the luxury to work exclusively within the system because of the work of the state in disenfranchising the political power of these communities. But at the same time, there was a recognition that the collective power can be brought to bear and that participants in the political systems and public sphere can also happen within the state. In some ways, it makes it difficult to have an apolitical faith, as faith that doesn't address the actions of the state against the dignity of communities of color runs the risk of losing its ability to bear witness to God's character. In conclusion, by incorporating and considering some of the particularities from the Filipino American and Japanese American experience and the fragments offered by these communities, these instances and examples might lead us to some helpful corrections that will keep the American expression of civil religion from becoming one that can be fueled for a Christian nationalism that places country at the center rather than Jesus at the center. Some of the insights from these fragments can help Christians keep a critical or skeptical eye as they participate in the public sphere. In some ways, this might also help to keep the church from being used simply as a tool of the state, but rather keep the public space as a place under God's rule in which God's work might be working through or outside of the political systems. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your attention today.